Every single day, this prisoner did one thing and one thing only. He'd deliberately get close to the guards, studying the keys dangling from their belts. Back in his cell, he'd sketch out their exact shapes from memory. He couldn't afford a single mistake. Even the tiniest detail, Michael would redraw dozens of times, all to replicate those keys as precisely as possible. But he was far from done. After the guards finished their rounds, he'd strike a match and carefully examine the keyhole on his cell door. Then he'd take a sheet of white paper, press it gently over the keyhole, and rub it back and forth with his fingers. That gave him the outer shape of the lock. But how do you figure out what's going on inside? Simple. He'd roll the paper into a thin tube, slide it into the keyhole, and twist it around with a small stick. Just like that, the internal structure of the lock was imprinted onto the paper. Then he'd compare it against his key sketches. But even with the blueprints, escaping was still a long way off. Michael needed to actually build the keys, and getting the right materials was a serious problem. But Michael was sharp. He came up with a solution fast. He'd carved the keys out of wood. Metal was nearly impossible to get your hands on in prison, but wood was everywhere. His cellmate laughed at him. A wooden key would snap the second you touched it. But Michael said as long as you follow the grooves of the lock, it won't break. Seeing how dead serious they both were, John finally agreed to go along with it. As luck would have it, they were assigned to the woodshop that day. Michael quickly carved a rough prototype based on his sketches. All he had to do now was smuggle it back and refine it. To keep the guards from noticing, he stuffed the piece inside his water flask. Then he signaled his partner to create a distraction. The moment the guard looked away, Michael threw a towel over the top of the flask, but things didn't go as smoothly as planned. On the way out, Michael was so tense that his face gave him away, and the guard noticed. The guard grabbed his thermos and dumped out the coffee without hesitation. Thanks to the damp towel clinging to the inside, the prototype didn't fall out. The guard shook it a few more times, and when nothing came loose, he handed it back. Just like that, Michael had his materials. All he needed now was a file to carve the key into shape. Then he glued the pieces together, and the wooden key was complete. The glue had been smuggled in by an old inmate who'd been locked up for 80 years. It took everything he had to get it. Now came the moment of truth. Heart-pounding, Michael slid the key into the lock. When he heard that clean, crisp click from inside, he knew he'd done it. He pushed the door open and tasted freedom for the first time. But escaping was still a long way off. He needed to make keys for every single lock in the place. So from that point on, whenever he got the chance, Michael would stare at the keys on the guards' belts and burn every detail into his memory. He'd need to make dozens of these keys to open every door in the prison. And every time he finished one, he tested it, because the escape plan had to be flawless. With his partner running cover, Michael began his trials. He kept a file on him at all times so he could make adjustments on the spot. But this time, something went wrong. The key got jammed in the lock. He gave it just a little push, and it snapped clean in two. Michael nearly had a heart attack, and right at that moment, the lookout signaled a warning. Everyone scrambled back to work. Michael was in full panic mode, clawing at the lock cylinder with his bare fingers. At the last second, his cellmate rushed in with a tool. Michael grabbed it like a lifeline and frantically worked at the lock. The footsteps were getting closer. Even his partner was slapping his own leg in desperation. By some miracle, Michael managed to dig out all the wood shavings just before the guard arrived, but the bolt was still sticking out. The moment the guard left, Michael dropped his mop, sprinted to the door, and started pounding on it with his fist. 500 hits later, his hand was swollen and throbbing, but the bolt hadn't budged an inch. Out of options, Michael left it to fate. He collapsed onto his bed, utterly defeated, waiting for the punishment that was sure to come. Soon enough, a guard came by to lock up. Michael's head shot up like a startled bird. He was sure this was the end. But when the guard noticed the exposed bolt, he just glanced around casually and pulled the iron door shut. Back in his cell, Michael's heart was hammering out of his chest. But after a long silence with no commotion, he finally let out a deep breath. He dodged a bullet, barely. But even that close call wasn't enough to shake his resolve. To boost their chances, the three of them started sneaking in runs whenever they could. The keys were ready, but how do you unlock the door from inside the cell? John came up with an idea. Tie the key to a rope, feed it through to the other side, and guide it into the lock. But it was a dead end. There was no way to turn the key like that. Charlie suggested swapping the rope for a stick, but something that long would be impossible to hide. They debated for hours and got nowhere. Then one day, while Michael was working in the shop, he happened to notice the old inmate spinning a wheel, and it hit him. He crafted a wooden disc, mounted the key on it, then just had to reach it through the window and line it up with the lock. But after turning it for ages, the key didn't fit. He pulled it back in and filed it down. After several grueling attempts, Michael finally managed to open the cell door from the inside. He was ecstatic. But right at that moment, a guard came walking down the hall. If he was caught, it was game over. Michael went to pull the key back in, but it slipped and clattered to the ground. Now what? With the guard's footsteps closing in, Michael suddenly remembered he had one piece of chewing gum left. He shoved it in his mouth, chewed like crazy, and stuck it onto the end of his stick, hoping the gum would be sticky enough to grab the key. He finally got it to stick, but as he pulled it back up, he moved too fast and it dropped again. He tried once more, but the stick was too short to control properly. Again and again. Either the key fell or the gum came loose. Finally, after relentless trying, he got hold of the key, Pulling it back in, he didn't dare make a single wrong move. Everything had to be slow and careful. Once the key was safely in his hands, Michael threw himself onto the bed, gasping for air, unable to calm his nerves for a long time. The next day, he shared the good news with his partners. They were thrilled. They decided to scout the escape route that very day. The old inmate agreed to help, though he didn't believe for a second they'd actually make it out. He was only doing it to protect the other prisoners, because if the escape went wrong, everyone would pay the price. That night, Michael placed a dummy in his bed. When the guards played the nightly music, he quietly pushed open his cell door. John stepped out too. Michael quickly unlocked the next door with one of his handmade keys. To stay silent, they went barefoot. Soon they reached the ground floor where an iron gate stood in their way. Michael pulled out a key and tried it. Wrong one. He grabbed the next. Under that crushing pressure, beads of sweat rolled down his face. After several tries, he finally found the right key. But just as they were about to push through, they heard footsteps. He quickly relocked the door and ducked into a storage closet under the stairwell. The problem was, this door's lock was broken. It wouldn't stay shut. Michael pinched the screw with 2 fingers, trying to hold it closed, but there was barely anything to grip. The guard was right at the door now, and Michael's fingers gave out. Luckily, John found a piece of wire just in time and yanked the door back shut. They held their breath, terrified of making a sound. Once the guard headed upstairs, they slipped back out. Their trial run wasn't over. This kind of risk was necessary to make the real escape foolproof. Every time they opened a door, they marked the matching key. Meanwhile, a guard was checking the cells upstairs. It was too dark for him to notice the dummy lying in Michael's bed. When the test was done, Michael quickly locked up again and ducked back into the closet. The guard had just finished his rounds and was heading downstairs. As he walked, he noticed a few drops of sweat on the floor. He hadn't been sweating, so whose was it? Inside the closet, the 2 men were trembling uncontrollably. If they were discovered, it was all over. Fortunately, the guard looked up at the ceiling, assumed it was a leak, wiped it up, and walked away. They finally exhaled, quietly shut the door, and crept back to their cells. As a precaution, Michael took his keys apart and stashed the pieces in his toothbrush cup. He'd been up so late the night before that even 30 minutes after the wake-up bell, he was still dead asleep. A guard came to check on him, and that's when he realized he was in trouble. Facing the captain's questions, Michael couldn't come up with a single excuse. All he could do was apologize over and over. The captain sensed something was off and ordered a search. As it turned out, everyone had overslept. John's drawing of his son was confiscated too. No matter how much he begged, the guard refused to give it back. John only got 30 minutes a year with his son. If it weren't for his boy, he probably wouldn't have lasted this long. That was the whole reason he'd chosen to escape. 3 minutes later, Michael was called in. The captain told him he wasn't allowed to read those useless books anymore, then angrily knocked the toothbrush cup off the table. Michael was wound tight as a spring. And of course, the thing he dreaded most happened next. The captain spotted key fragments on the floor. Seeing the panic on Michael's face only deepened his suspicion, but Michael's quick thinking saved him. He said the pieces were for holding up a photo, and the captain bought it. After they left, Michael clamped his hand over his mouth, terrified he might scream from sheer panic. He knew he had to move fast. If he waited any longer, they'd figure it out eventually. From then on, every chance he got, he memorized the guards' keys and crafted replicas. He buried the wood shavings in the garden when he worked outside, and at night, he and his partners ran their tests. 6 months passed. Keys for all 15 gates were finally complete. Just to be safe, Michael made 24 extras, but keys alone weren't enough. They needed a map of the city to plan their escape route. He asked Paolo, who was on garbage duty, to get him a newspaper, one that had a map printed in it. Paolo's price was a bag of snacks and a bar of soap. Michael gave a quick gesture. Deal. The next day at mealtime, Paolo signaled that the newspaper was ready. What they didn't realize was that a guard had been watching the whole exchange. Michael rushed downstairs to take out the garbage, and sure enough, there was the newspaper tucked inside the bin. He left the snacks and soap at the bottom as promised. But the very next day, a guard came to deliver the news. Paolo had been executed. If you don't want to end up like him, you'd better behave. Hearing that, Michael knew there was no more time to waste. Tonight was the night. He invited everyone in the block, hoping they'd all break out together. But the seasoned old inmate knew better. There was no way they'd make it. He said, "Get caught, and you're dead." He'd gotten used to life inside and wasn't about to take that gamble. He said he'd only helped because they were fellow inmates, nothing more. The others felt the same. The 3 of them had no choice but to go it alone. But the moment they got back to their cells, the guards showed up for a surprise inspection. Once again, nothing was found. As soon as the guards left, Michael opened his cell door and let John and Charlie out. The 3 of them found a corner and changed into the civilian clothes they'd prepared in advance. Right then, a guard went into the storage closet to grab something and noticed the wire on the lock. Meanwhile, the escape team had reached the iron gate. But when they heard footsteps below, they pulled back and waited. Only when the sound faded did they dare go downstairs. They ducked into the closet, planning to wait out the guards' patrol. Michael reached for the wire to secure the door, but it was gone. He had no choice but to hold it shut with his fingers again. And because this particular guard was so overweight, he could barely walk fast. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, wheezing and catching his breath, refusing to go up. Michael's fingers were dying. Just when he was about to lose his grip, the old inmate came through. He called out to the guard from upstairs, finally luring him away. The three of them scrambled out, threw open the iron gate, and pushed forward. As Michael unlocked each new door, Charlie would close and relock the one behind them. One opens, one closes. They moved fast, until they reached the electric gate. Freedom felt like it was right there. But when they got to the workshop door, they hit a disagreement. John was sure it needed a round-headed key. Michael remembered it as flat. They nearly got into a fight over it. Charlie stepped in just in time. Just try both. But one key after another came up wrong. Then they heard a door opening nearby. The guard was done with his rounds. Michael still couldn't find the right key. John couldn't take it anymore. He shoved Michael aside, stepped up, and opened the door like it was nothing. The whole time, Michael just hadn't pushed the key in far enough. Now there was only one gate left. And even better, the outer door was wide open. Freedom was right there. All three couldn't help but grin. They pulled each other into a tight embrace, celebrating the moment. But just when it seemed like they'd made it, Michael tried key after key on the final lock, and none of them worked. With his last shred of hope, he tried the very last key. He turned and turned, but nothing happened. That's when it hit them. The guards never carried the key to this door on their belts. Now what? Go all the way back? After everything they'd been through? But if they stayed and got caught, they'd be shot. John knocked on the door panel, hollow. It was wood, and if it was wood, it could be broken. Without a second thought, he pulled out the file and started smashing. The other two flinched. That kind of noise would bring every guard running. But at this point, there was no turning back. As John's hands moved faster, their heartbeats raced to match. 10 minutes later, they'd broken through the lock. They quickly changed into their civilian clothes. And when that door swung open, it felt like being born again. John was about to bolt outside, but the other two grabbed him and pulled him back. There was still a guard on patrol above. They waited for the guard to turn around, then crept to the doorway. Once they were all through, Michael followed the map and led them into the night. John and Charlie hung back for a moment, still gripped by fear. It all felt too surreal, but there was no going back now. They steeled themselves and followed. Along the way, the three of them had to play it cool, walk naturally, don't attract attention. Before long, they were beyond the prison's perimeter. They flagged down a taxi and headed for another city. Back at the prison, the guards opened the cell doors for morning roll call as usual. Everyone filed out, except Michael's group. When the guard finally checked the room, he froze in horror. There was no Michael, just a crudely made dummy lying in the bed. He couldn't wrap his head around it. How does a full-grown man just vanish into thin air? By the time it sank in, it was far too late. Seeing the commotion, the old inmate burst out laughing. He couldn't believe they'd actually pulled it off. But at the same time, a wave of regret washed over him. He wished he'd gone with them. The three free men couldn't contain their joy any longer. They threw back their heads and shouted at the top of their lungs. This is a true story. Michael is based on Tim Jenkin, a quiet craftsman, or more precisely, a freedom fighter. How do you accomplish the impossible? You break it down into one small, achievable goal after another, just like one small key after another.